With a heart cracked like earth in drought, Clara gazed at the horizon with empty eyes. Her father's absence had settled into the wooden walls like the persistent smell of rain on dry earth. Her hands, rough from surviving alone, no longer remembered the warmth of other hands. Until one sunset amid the silence of the Montana mountains, a stranger followed the smoke from her chimney. And at the crossing of two solitudes, in the brush of trembling fingers serving a bowl of soup, life whispered her name again. If this story of loss and rebirth echoes in your soul, leave your heart as a like someone lighting a candle in the window for lost travelers, and tell us, how do you think this story between smoke and hope will end? Your voice is part of the path we walk together. The spring of 1883 arrived slowly and cautiously to the hills of Montana Territory, like a moire. Timid promise whispered between the last ice of winter. Clara Whitmore observed everything from the small porch of her pine cabin, with eyes the color of clouds before a storm. Her hands, rough like the bark of the trees surrounding her home, moved mechanically over the bowl where she was shelling peas, while her mind wandered through the recesses of a solitude that had become as familiar as it was unsettling. The past winter had been the first without her father. Samuel Whitmore's absence seemed to have settled into the wooden walls like the persistent smell of burned firewood, permeating every corner, every object, every silence. Clara had learned to survive. Her father had taught her to shoot, to hunt, to repair fences and to keep strangers away, but he never taught her how to fill the void his departure would leave. That afternoon, while scattering grain for the chickens, a movement in the distance caught her attention. A figure on horseback slowly advanced along the path that wound between the pines, following the trail of smoke rising from her chimney. Clara dropped the sack of grain and, with the fluidity of an animal accustomed to constant vigilance, entered the cabin and took the rifle that her father always kept loaded by the door. The rider approached slowly without sudden gestures. As the distance between them decreased, Clara could make out a man with broad shoulders and upright posture, with a trimmed beard sprinkled with premature grey. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance and dismounted with deliberately slow movements. "Good afternoon, miss," he said, removing his hat with a gesture that spoke of other times, of places where custom still meant something. "My name is Elias Boone. I'm on my way to Fort Benton, but the storm caught me by surprise. My horse has lost a horseshoe and won't get far in this terrain. I saw the smoke from your chimney and thought that perhaps—" He broke off when he noticed the rifle Clara was holding firmly against her shoulder, her index finger brushing the trigger, with the familiarity of one who has grown up knowing that survival sometimes depends on an instant of decision. "Come in," she finally said, with a voice that revealed little. "But you'll sleep in the stable." He nodded slightly, as if that answer was exactly what he expected, no more, no less. There was something in his gaze, a weariness that went beyond the journey, that Clara instinctively recognized. It was the look of someone who also carried his own winters. Chapter 2. The language of silence dinner was an exercise in interwoven silences. Clara served rabbit stew in chipped bowls that had survived the journey from Pennsylvania years earlier. The sound of spoons against ceramic marked an irregular rhythm, like a conversation that neither knew how to begin. Elias ate with measured gestures, without the desperation of the hungry or the indifference of the satisfied. His eyes, a dark brown that recalled damp earth after rain, remained mostly fixed on his plate, rising only occasionally to study the small cabin with a gaze that did not judge, only observed. "It's a good stew," he commented at one point, like someone offering a small but legitimate coin. "It's been a long time since I've tasted home cooking." Clara nodded without responding. Words were dangerous territory. She had learned that, too often, they served more to confuse than to communicate. But Elias's comment floated in the cabin's air, settling slowly like the first layer of snow on uneven ground, softening the roughness. When they finished, Clara collected the plates and immersed them in the lukewarm water she had heated on the stove. The sound of water, the circular movements of her hands while washing, created a small universe of normality in that extraordinary situation. Through the window, she observed how Elias led his horse to the stable, with movements that spoke of respect for the animal. Each gesture revealed fragments of his character, The careful way he loosened the girth, how he caressed the sweaty neck of the horse, the patience with which he examined the hoof that had lost its shoe. That night, Clara took a long time to fall asleep. From her narrow bed, she could hear the wind beating against the walls of the stable, imagining the stranger wrapped in his own blanket, perhaps as awake as she was. The presence of another person, even at that distance, altered the fragile balance she had built. She felt as if solitude, her faithful companion for so many months, had slightly moved away, observing her from the shadows with expectant curiosity. Before falling asleep, Clara heard a sound she hadn't heard in a long time, the soft whinny of a horse responding to words whispered in the darkness. The sound traversed the night like an invisible thread, connecting for an instant the stable with the cabin, reminding her that there existed languages older than words. Chapter 3. The hands that build dawn arrived wrapped in fog, blurring the contours of the trees and creating the illusion of a world suspended between reality and dream. Clara rose with the first rays of sun, as was her custom. Upon opening the door, she found a small pile of freshly cut wood next to the porch. The regularity of the pieces spoke of precise hands and a well-sharpened axe. Elias appeared shortly after, emerging from the fog like a figure from another time. He carried his hat in his hand, and his dark hair, streaked with grey at the temples, was damp with morning dew. "I saw that the fence on the west side is down," he said by way of greeting. "I can repair it before continuing my journey, as thanks for your hospitality." Clara wanted to say it wasn't necessary, that she was used to making repairs herself, that she didn't need a stranger's help. But the words stopped before reaching her lips. Instead, she found herself nodding slightly while serving coffee in 2 unequal cups. During the following days, a silent routine was established between them. Elias worked from dawn, repairing the fence that winter had knocked down, cutting wood that he stacked with almost artistic precision, reinforcing the chicken coop roof that threatened to give way under the weight of the last snowfalls. Clara continued with her usual tasks, feeding the animals, kneading bread, hanging the skins of rabbits she hunted in the nearby forest. Their paths crossed at precise moments of the day, during meals, when drawing water from the well, when briefly gathering by the fire before Elias returned to the stable at nightfall. One afternoon, while they were pulling together on the well bucket, Clara felt a sudden impulse, like a crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. "I've never been kissed," she said, surprising herself with the confession. The words hung suspended. Between them, as unexpected as a snowfall in summer, Elias looked up. His eyes, habitually cautious, lingered on her with a new intensity. For a moment, Clara feared having crossed an invisible boundary, having broken the fragile balance they had established. "Then we'll go slowly," he finally replied, with a deep and serene voice that seemed to merge with the sound of wind through the pines. There were no more words. They continued pulling on the rope, the squeak of the pulley mixing with the bird song and the constant whisper of the trees. But something had changed, as subtle as the first green shoot after the thaw, as irreversible as the passing of seasons. Chapter 4. Thaw time flowed like thaw water, slow at first, then with a growing force impossible to contain. The days lengthened, and with them the space Elias occupied in Clara's life. Without openly discussing it, he had moved from the stable to the small annex of the cabin, a space that Samuel Whitmore had used as a workshop. The horseshoe had been repaired weeks ago, and the road to Fort Benton had become an increasingly distant reference, mentioned occasionally as a destination that no longer pressed. On a particularly luminous morning in late April, Clara found herself watching Elias as he repaired the handle of an axe. His hands moved with the wisdom of one who has learned that each material has its own language. There was a story in those hands, old scars, calluses formed by diverse work, a controlled strength that was never abrupt. Clara wondered how many objects they had held, how many paths they had traveled before reaching her. "There's a grove of wild plum trees half an hour from here," she said, breaking the contemplative silence. "My father used to take me when I was a child. They're blooming now." It was an invitation, though she did not formulate it as such. Elias looked at her, and Clara could see the understanding in his eyes, the comprehension of what it meant to share a place kept in memory. That afternoon, they rode together. Clara led the way, occasionally pointing out some feature of the terrain or naming the plants her father had taught her to recognize. Elias listened attentively, as if each word were a gift he received with reverence. The plum grove appeared before them like a vision, dozens of trees covered with white flowers that contrasted with the dark green of the surrounding pines. They dismounted and walked among the trees, enveloped in the sweet perfume of petals and the buzz of bees fluttering from flower to flower. "It's like entering a dream," murmured Elias, his gaze raised toward the branches covered with flowers. Clara nodded, feeling a strange mixture of happiness and melancholy. Memories of her father intertwined with the present, creating a new and complex fabric of emotions. They sat under one of the largest trees, silently sharing the bread and cheese they had brought. White petals occasionally fell, landing on Clara's. Hair on Elias's hat, on the blanket they had spread over the grass. Time seemed to have stopped, creating a parenthesis in the usual succession of days. "I was a Confederate messenger during the Civil War," Elias suddenly said, his gaze fixed on some point on the horizon. "My younger brother, Thomas, died at the Battle of Franklin. He was 16 years old." Clara remained motionless, aware that she was witnessing something as fragile as the petals falling around them. It was the first time Elias had mentioned his past, the first crack in the reserve that both had maintained as a protective wall. "Since then, I've been looking for a place where the silence doesn't hurt," he continued, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "I've never told anyone this in the West." Clara extended her hand and took Elias's. It was a simple gesture, but at that moment, under the flowering plum trees, with memories floating between them like petals carried by the wind, it seemed to contain an entire language. "The silence here is different," she replied, gently squeezing Elias's hand. "We build it ourselves." Chapter 5. The wisdom of the earth. As spring advanced towards summer, the bond between Clara and Elias strengthened, like the roots of trees that intertwine beneath the earth, invisible but increasingly deep. He taught her to track deer by following signs that had previously gone unnoticed by her. A broken branch at a certain height, the way the grass bent, fresh droppings that indicated the proximity of the animal. He showed her how to improve the drainage of the low lands near the stream, digging strategic ditches that directed water away from the crops. Clara, in turn, shared the knowledge her father had transmitted to her: which herbs to gather to cure different ailments, how to read the sky to predict storms, the way to preserve food for the long winter months. Together they learned to cultivate the rocky soil of Montana, combining techniques she had brought from Pennsylvania with methods he had observed in his travels through the West. Their hands met with increasing frequency, when passing tools, when working side by side in the garden, when sitting by the fire on cool nights. Each contact was brief but meaningful, as if their skin established a conversation parallel to the one they maintained with words. One afternoon, while Elias was building a scarecrow for the newly sown garden, Clara observed attentively the meticulous way he tied the sticks to form the structure. "Where did you learn to make knots like that?" she asked, approaching to better examine the work. Elias smiled, an expression that still rarely appeared on his face, like a cautious visitor. "My father was a shipwright in Charleston," he replied, his fingers moving with precision over the "Oh. Before the war, I spent hours on the docks watching the sailors. They have a knot for every purpose." Clara nodded, fascinated as much by the skill as by this new fragment of Elias's past that emerged like a long-buried treasure. "My mother used to say that hands reveal more than words," she commented, extending her own hands to help hold the structure, "that you can know the soul of a person by observing how they treat what they build or repair." Elias stopped his movements and looked directly at Clara. The intensity of his gaze contained unformulated questions, silent acknowledgments, promises not yet pronounced. "And what do my hands tell you, Clara Whitmore?" The question floated between them, laden with meanings that went beyond words. Clara held his gaze, feeling how something inside her, a wall, a resistance, An ancient fear began to yield like ice under the spring sun. "They tell me that you build with care," she finally replied, with a voice barely louder than a whisper. "That you respect the nature of what you touch, that you're not in a hurry." Elias nodded slowly, as if he had just received an answer to a much deeper question than the one he had formulated. "The earth teaches us patience," he said, returning to his task with renewed concentration. "We cannot hurry the growth of a seed, nor force a tree to bear fruit before its time. Everything has its rhythm." That night, as Clara braided her hair, in front of the small cracked mirror that had belonged to her mother, she reflected on Elias's words. She wondered if she too was like the earth, slow to trust, cautious in revealing her secrets, but capable of immense generosity once the roots had penetrated deep enough. Chapter 6. The Dance of Strangers. The news arrived with the traveling salesman who passed through the region every 2 months, bringing fabrics, medicines, tools, and, most valuable of all, news from the outside world. There would be a dance in the town to celebrate Independence Day, an event that would be attended by families from all the surrounding farms and ranches. Clara had always avoided these social events. Since her father's death, the looks of compassion, mixed with disapproval, how could a young woman live alone in those wild lands, were unbearable to her. But this time, as the salesman continued on his way, leaving behind a trail of dust and rumors, Clara felt an inexplicable impulse. "Let's go together," she told Elias that same afternoon, as they harvested the last turnips from the garden. He looked at her with surprise, stopping his movements as if he needed to make sure he had heard correctly. "Are you sure?" he asked cautiously. "Oh, you haven't mentioned having friendships in town." Clara continued pulling turnips from the earth, avoiding his gaze. Her hands moved with the precision born of habit, while her mind explored this new territory. "I don't have any," she confirmed, "but perhaps it's time to let others see that I'm no longer alone." The words hung suspended between them, charged, with a meaning that went beyond the simple invitation to a dance. For the first time, Clara had expressed aloud what both knew, that something had changed, that Elias's temporary presence had transformed into something permanent, although neither had named that transformation. The night of the dance, Clara took from the cedar chest the only dress that wasn't for work, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, adapted by her own hands to her taller and slimmer figure. As she put up her hair, leaving some brown locks to frame her face, she was surprised to notice the nervousness that filled her, a sensation almost forgotten that dated back to her adolescence in Pennsylvania. Elias waited for her by the wagon, dressed in his only clean shirt and a dark vest that Clara had never seen him wear. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair back, revealing more clearly the features that daily work and habit had made familiar to her: the strong jaw, the deep eyes under thick eyebrows, the small wrinkles at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his hand to help her onto the wagon. The town was transformed that night. Paper lanterns hung between the trees in the square, and lamps shone in the windows of the school, converted, for one night, into a dance hall. The sound of a violin and an accordion escaped through the open doors, mixing with laughter and conversations. Clara felt the gazes as soon as they entered. The whispers began immediately, moving like a wave in water. Whitmore's daughter had come, and she wasn't alone. She instinctively pressed Elias's arm, seeking an anchor in that sea of curiosity and barely disguised judgments. "They don't matter," he murmured, leaning slightly toward her. "They're just noise." The night advanced slowly. Clara exchanged cautious greetings with old acquaintances, formally introduced Elias, avoiding defining exactly what he was to her, and observed the dances from a corner, feeling that she both belonged and didn't belong to that community at the same time. When the music changed to a slower melody, Elias approached and extended his hand in a silent invitation. Clara hesitated for an instant, aware that accepting meant exposing herself even more to the looks and comments. But something had changed in her. The eyes of others no longer had the weight they once had. As they danced, moving with the caution of those who are learning to synchronize their rhythms, Clara realized a simple but profound truth. The opinion of those people no longer defined her value nor her decisions. It was as if, during the months with Elias, she had rebuilt not only her practical life but also her sense of self. "This is no longer your burden," Elias whispered against her hair, as if he had read her thoughts. "You don't have to carry it anymore." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, allowing herself a gesture of intimacy that, at another time, would have seemed unthinkable in public. In that instant, under the trembling light of the lamps and the creaking of the wooden floor, she felt something inside her release, like a river that finally finds its channel after having been contained too long. Chapter 7. The drought. The following summer brought with it a drought that the oldest people in the territory described as the worst in decades. The sky, of a relentless blue day after day, seemed to have forgotten the language of clouds. The earth cracked under the merciless sun, and the stream that ran near the property was reduced to a thread of water barely sufficient for the birds. Clara watched helplessly as the garden that had cost them so much work began to wither. The plants shrank under the heat, the leaves turned yellowish, and the promised fruits remained mere possibility. Each morning she went out at dawn to water with the carefully rationed water from the well, but it was like trying to put out a fire. With drops, the level of the well dropped day by day. Clara knew the pattern of water in those lands, knew how to read the signs. If the drought continued, in 2 weeks the well would be dry. Elias measured the level each dawn with a marked rope, his face becoming more grave with each centimeter, that the water receded. One night, as they dined in silence, interrupted only by the desperate song of crickets, he made a decision. "I'll go to the Missouri River," he announced, cutting a piece of hard bread. "With the big wagon and barrels. 3 days there, 3 back." Clara felt her stomach contract. The journey to the Missouri was not only long, but dangerous. The territory between her property and the river was sparsely populated, and the few settlements were off the direct route. Furthermore, in times of drought, water became a good more valuable than gold. There were stories of travelers assaulted for their water cargo, of deadly disputes over irrigation rights. "We can resist," she argued, though she knew it wasn't true. "Perhaps it will rain soon." Elias looked up from his plate. His eyes, normally serene, showed a determination that Clara had seen few times. "It won't rain," he replied, with the certainty of one who has learned to read the sky. "And when the well dries up, the animals will die first, then the garden. Then we will have to leave. I don't intend to watch everything we've built crumble without doing anything." Clara kept silent. In his words, everything we've built. She recognized a truth that had been forging day by day, month by month. This was no longer just her land, her struggle. It was both of theirs. And Elias's determination was not just stubbornness. It was the commitment of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Elias departed at dawn the next day, with the wagon loaded with empty barrels and provisions for the journey. Clara watched him move away, a figure growing smaller, on the dusty horizon, until he merged with the line where earth met sky. They had never been separated since that first night when he arrived following the smoke from her chimney. The days without Elias passed with a painful slowness. Clara rationed the water with mathematical precision, giving priority to the animals and the most vulnerable plants. At night, sitting on the porch, she scrutinized the horizon as if she could conjure Elias's figure with the force of her gaze. On the 3rd day, the water reserves were practically exhausted. The well barely offered a half-filled bucket each morning. Clara began to mentally prepare for the worst. They would have to sacrifice some animals, abandon the garden, perhaps even temporarily leave the property. It was then that she saw it, a cloud of dust in the distance that could only mean a wagon approaching. She ran toward the road, her heart beating with a mixture of hope and fear. As the wagon approached, she distinguished Elias's figure, hunched over the reins, urging on the exhausted horses. When he finally reached the yard, Clara could see the state he was in, covered with dust, his skin burned by the sun, his lips cracked from dehydration. But the barrels in the wagon were full, secured with ropes and protected with tarps. Elias descended with difficulty, his legs trembling from exhaustion. Clara ran to him, and without thinking, embraced him with all her strength. It was the first time they had allowed themselves such complete contact, so desperate in its need to confirm the other's presence. "I thought I wouldn't get back in time," he murmured against her hair, his voice hoarse from thirst and fatigue. "The river is lower than ever. I had to travel further north, toward the mountains." That night, after drinking, giving water to the animals, and watering the thirstiest plants, Clara observed Elias asleep on his cot. For the first time since she had known him, she had seen him lose his usual composure, in that embrace in the yard, in the urgency of his words, in the way his hands trembled while unloading the barrels. She then understood that the control Elias maintained over himself was not coldness, as she had thought at first, but an armor built by years of losses and solitudes. And that armor had cracked not from weakness, but from the strength of what they had built together. That night Clara made a decision. When the rains came, when the crisis had passed, she would ask him to stay. Not as the visitor who never left, but as the person with whom she wanted to share all that would come after. Chapter 8. The Heart's Decision. The rains arrived in early September, sudden and abundant, like an apology from the sky for the long absence. For days water fell in silver curtains, transforming the dried landscape into a canvas of renewed greens. The stream flowed strongly again, the well filled to the brim, and the plants that had survived the drought began to show new shoots like small flags of hope. Clara and Elias worked side by side, taking advantage of the moisture to replant, to reinforce the irrigation channels, to prepare the land for the next cycle. Their bodies moved in a synchrony, born of months of shared labor, anticipating the needs of the other, complementing each other in a silent dance of efficiency and companionship. One afternoon, while they were repairing together the roof damaged by the wind that had accompanied the first storms, Clara gathered the courage for the conversation she had been postponing. "Elias," she began, passing him a nail while he secured a board, "winter will arrive soon." He nodded without diverting his attention from his task, but Clara noticed that his movements became slower, more conscious, as if he were listening not only with his ears, but with his entire being. "The annex is too cold for that time of year," she continued, carefully choosing each word. You could move into the cabin." Elias's hands stopped completely. Slowly, like someone who fears breaking something extremely fragile, he turned to look at her. His eyes sought Clara's, questioning, cautious, but with a gleam of something she recognized as hope. "Are you sure?" he asked in a voice that tried to remain firm. Clara held his gaze. Her heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it, mixing with the sound of drops still falling from the eaves. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied, and was surprised by the firmness of her own voice, by the clarity with which the words emerged from a place of certainty she didn't know she possessed. That night, for the first time, they shared not only the space of the cabin, but also the bed that Clara had inherited from her parents. Under the patchwork quilt that she herself had sewn, their bodies found a new language older than words, more eloquent than any promise. The days acquired a different rhythm. The routines remained the same, caring for the animals, preparing meals, the constant maintenance that life on the frontier demanded, but now they were interwoven with moments of intimacy that went beyond the physical. The way Elias brushed her hair at night, how Clara prepared tea with the herbs she knew he preferred, the conversations whispered in the darkness about distant childhoods, abandoned dreams, hopes that were beginning to be reborn. One morning, while they were having breakfast, Elias raised an idea that had been maturing in silence. "We could expand the cabin," he said, tracing an imaginary plan on the wooden table with his finger. "Add a room to the east, where the morning sun shines, with large windows." Clara looked at him, understanding the meaning behind the proposal. It wasn't just a practical improvement, it was a declaration of permanence, a commitment to a shared future. "A room for what?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Elias held her gaze, his eyes conveying all that he still found difficult to express with words. "For what comes after," he replied simply. "For the family we could be." Clara felt something expand inside her, like a field flowering after the rain. The word family evoked images she had kept in the deepest part of herself. A child with Elias's eyes and her own stubbornness, a table with more chairs, laughter filling spaces that for so long had been occupied only by silence. "Yes," she said, extending her hand to take his. "A room with large windows." Construction began before the first snowfall. Elias worked with methodical precision, using wood he had carefully selected at the town's sawmill. Clara helped him, holding beams, mixing mortar for the new chimney, sewing curtains for windows that did not yet exist, but that she already imagined letting in the dawn light. The day they placed the door frame that would connect the new room. With the rest of the cabin, Elias carved their intertwined initials at the top, E and C. It was such an intimate, permanent gesture that Clara felt tears forming in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the letters carved in the wood. "It's just the beginning," Elias replied, and in his words Clara heard the promise of all the days to come, of all the marks they would leave together in the Phi world. Chapter 9. Seeds of future winter arrived with its white mantle, isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. Snow covered the paths, transformed the pines into ghostly sculptures, and created a different silence, denser, as if nature held its breath until spring. In the intimacy forced by the weather, Clara and Elias established new rituals. The nights, lengthened, illuminated only by the fire in the chimney and some oil lamps. Elias carved figures in wood, animals mainly, with a precision that revealed hours of patient observation, while Clara sewed or read aloud the few books they owned, stories they already knew, but that acquired new meanings when shared. It was during one of those nights, while snow gently beat against the windows like ghostly fingers, when Clara felt for the first time the movement inside her, as light as the flutter of a bird, but unmistakable in its novelty. She instinctively brought a hand to her belly, which was just beginning to show the curvature of the new life growing there. Elias, who was carving a small pine deer, noticed the gesture and set his work aside. He approached and knelt before her, his eyes asking what his lips dared not formulate. "It moved," Clara confirmed, taking Elias's hand and placing it on the exact spot, though she knew it was too early for him to feel anything. As if it wanted to introduce itself. Elias's expression transformed. Amazement, fear, and a joy almost painful in its intensity mixed in his normally reserved face. "Hello," he whispered toward Clara's belly, with a voice she had never heard from him, soft and reverent. "We're waiting for you." The months that followed were of preparation, both practical and emotional. Elias accelerated work on the new room, installing the floor, finishing the walls, ensuring it was ready long before the baby's arrival. With his own hands, he carved a pine cradle, working on each detail with the precision of one who creates not just an object, but a symbol. Clara, for her part, unearthed memories of her own childhood, lullabies her mother sang to her, stories her father told her on winter nights. She prepared small garments with scraps of the blue shawl she had worn the night of the dance, sewing silent wishes for the boy or girl who would come into each one. Spring brought the thaw, and with it, the possibility of trips to town. Elias insisted on bringing the midwife to examine Clara, despite her protests, which assured that frontier women had given birth without help for generations. "You're not just a frontier woman," Elias reminded her with gentleness but firmness. "You're the woman I love, and I won't take unnecessary risks." It was the first time he had expressed his love in such direct words. Clara, surprised by the declaration more than by the argument, agreed. Mrs. Patterson, a woman of indeterminate age with gentle hands and eyes that seemed to have seen everything, confirmed that both Clara and the baby were healthy. She predicted an uncomplicated birth for late summer and left precise instructions about herbs that should be collected, preparations that should be made, and signs they should be alert for. When the midwife left, Clara found Elias on the porch, his gaze lost in the horizon and an expression she couldn't interpret. "What's happening?" she asked, sitting next to him on the bench they had built together the previous autumn. Elias remained silent for a moment, as if searching for the exact words to express what he felt. "I'm afraid," he finally admitted, with an honesty that must have cost him an enormous effort. "Not of the birth, although that also frightens me. I'm afraid of not being enough." Clara took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Nobody knows how to be a father until they are one," she said, resting her head on Elias's shoulder. "My father used to say that each day he learned something new about how to be one, even when I was already an adult." Elias nodded, gently squeezing Clara's hand. "My father wasn't a good example," he confessed, his gaze still fixed on some distant point. "He was a hard man who believed that showing affection was a weakness. The war hardened him even more. I don't want to be like that." "You won't be," Clara assured with a certainty that was born from months observing the gentleness of his hands, the patience of his teachings, the way he treated even the smallest animals on the farm. "You'll be the father you choose to be." That night, while Clara slept, Elias began to secretly carve a small wooden amulet, a tree with deep roots and branches that extended toward the sky. It would be his first gift for the child, a symbol of all he wished for him: strength, growth, connection with the earth, and aspiration toward the heights. Chapter X. The Birth Jonas. Whitmore Boone was born on a night in late August, when the heat of summer began to yield to the first hints of autumn. He came into the world after a long but uncomplicated labor, assisted by Mrs. Patterson and a neighbor who had ridden from her ranch at Elias's first message. The child's first cry resonated in the cabin like the most powerful sound its walls had ever contained. Clara, exhausted but radiant, extended her arms to receive her son, wrapped in the blanket she had woven during the last months of waiting. Feeling the weight of that new life against her chest, she experienced an emotion that was unlike anything she had known before, a fierce, protective, absolute love, mixed with a reverent awe at the miracle she had just witnessed. Elias, who had remained by her side during the hours of labor, holding her hand, cleaning the sweat from her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement, observed the scene with moist eyes. When Clara offered him to hold his son for the first time, his hands, so sure when handling tools, when building, when working the land, trembled slightly. With infinite delicacy, like one who handles the most fragile and precious object in the world, he took little Jonas in his arms. "Hello, son," he whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. "We've been waiting for you." The following days passed in a haze of fatigue, adjustments, and discoveries. Clara learned the new language of her body, now a source of nourishment for another life. Elias adapted to the interrupted routines, to the nights fragmented by cries, to the extreme vulnerability of that being who depended completely on them. A week after the birth, when Mrs. Patterson considered that mother and child were strong enough, she returned to her own home, leaving them with detailed instructions, and the promise to return if they needed her. That night, for the first time, the newly formed family found itself truly alone. Jonas slept in the cradle that Elias had carved with such care, the small mouth making occasional sucking movements in dreams. Clara and Elias were sitting before the fire, exhausted, but with a new form of peace between them. "He's perfect," murmured Clara, leaning against Elias's shoulder. "He has your eyes." Elias smiled, that smile that was no longer an infrequent visitor on his face, but a regular inhabitant. "And your stubbornness," he replied, gently kissing Clara's head. "I haven't known anyone so determined to do things their own way from such an early age." The silence that followed was full of shared meanings, of mutual recognition, of gratitude for the path that had led them to that moment. Clara thought about the young woman she had been barely 2 years earlier, determined to survive, alone, determined not to need anyone. That Clara now seemed a stranger to her, someone whose strength she admired but whose solitude seemed incomprehensible. "Are you happy?" she asked, looking up at Elias. "Do you regret staying?" The question contained echoes of all her old insecurities, of doubts that, although diminished, never completely disappeared. Elias looked at her directly, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and something deeper, more constant. "Every encounter," he replied with simplicity, repeating the words he had said long ago. "Every moment since I saw the smoke from your chimney in the distance." Clara felt something settle inside her, like fertile soil after the rain. In that simple response, was the confirmation of what she already knew, that neither of them would ever be alone again, that they had built something that, like the expanded cabin, had solid foundations and room to grow. That night, with Jonas sleeping peacefully and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, Clara understood that her home was no longer just a physical place. It was this new constellation of people, this family they had created together, this love that was expressed not only in words, but in every daily gesture, in every shared decision, in every dawn that found them together under the same roof. Chapter 19. Roots and branches. Autumn brought with it an explosion of colors in the woods surrounding the property. The aspen trees dressed in gold, the wild maples in intense red, creating a mosaic that contrasted with the permanent green of the pines. It was as if nature celebrated Jonas's arrival with its most splendid display. As the leaves fell and the mornings grew colder, the rhythm of the small family adjusted to new routines. Clara gradually regained her strength, resuming tasks she had temporarily delegated. Jonas grew with the astonishing rapidity of newborns, each day more alert, more present in the world. Elias had built a baby carrier with strips of soft leather, which allowed Clara to carry Jonas against her chest while performing simple tasks. Frequently the child would fall asleep, lulled by the beating of his mother's heart and the rhythmic movement of her activities. On a particularly glorious afternoon, with the air fresh but not cold, and the sun creating golden patterns through the leaves, Clara suggested a visit to the plum grove. Although the trees were no longer in bloom, the place had a special meaning for both, a milestone in the history they shared. They rode there with Jonas firmly secured against Clara's chest. The baby observed everything with the absolute fascination of one who sees the world for the first time, the leaves moving against the blue sky, the changing shadows, the birds that occasionally crossed his field of vision. Upon reaching the clearing, where the plum trees grew, now laden with small still green fruits, they dismounted and spread a blanket over the grass. Elias took from his saddlebag a package wrapped in cloth, freshly baked bread, cheese, early apples, and a bottle of berry wine they had fermented the previous summer. As they ate, with Jonas lying between them, gnawing on a wooden toy that Elias had carved, Clara observed her family with a feeling of fullness she had never experienced before. It wasn't euphoric happiness, but something more solid, more sustainable, a deep sense of belonging, of being exactly where she should be. "This place reminds me of who we were then," she commented, picking a fallen leaf from Elias's hair with a gesture that had become natural. "And how much everything has changed." Elias nodded, his gaze moving between Clara and Jonas with an expression that mixed amazement and gratitude. "That day," he said, remembering the first time they visited the plum grove, "I told you about my brother. It was the first time I had spoken of him since coming to the West. I felt as if I could finally let that part of me breathe again." Clara extended her hand to take his, a gesture that had become their way of communicating what words didn't always reach. "And now there's a new life," she replied, looking at Jonas, who had dropped his toy and was watching with fascination a butterfly fluttering nearby. "A new beginning." Elias gently squeezed her hand. "Not a replacement," he clarified, with an intensity that revealed how important it was for him that Clara understand. "Never a replacement, but a continuation, like a tree that grows from its roots." Clara nodded, perfectly understanding what Elias wanted to say. The past, with its losses, its wounds, its lessons, didn't disappear with the arrival of present happiness. It integrated into it, informed it, made it deeper and more meaningful. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, tinting the forest with a golden and oblique light, Elias took from his pocket the small amulet he had carved during the last months of pregnancy, the tree with deep roots and branches extended toward the sky. "It's for Jonas," he explained, gently placing it in Clara's hand. "So he always remembers where he comes from and that he can grow in any direction he chooses." Clara examined the small carving, admiring the precision of the details, the roots that intertwined forming a solid base, the robust trunk, the branches that opened in patterns suggesting infinite possibilities. "It's beautiful," she said, feeling the smooth texture of wood worked with such care. "Someday we'll tell him the story of how you arrived following the smoke from my chimney, of how we built this together, one step at a time." Elias smiled, with that expression that made his eyes light up from within. "A story of smoke and wood," he replied, "of plum trees in bloom and dry wells, of decisions that seem small but change the entire path." As they returned home with the sun setting behind them, Clara thought about how stories shaped life, those we tell ourselves, those we share with others, those we inherit, and those we create. The story of her and Elias, which now included Jonas, was written not only in words, but in the wood of the expanded cabin, in the furrows of the garden they had sown together, in the small amulet their son would someday carry, in all the daily decisions that, added together, built a shared life. Chapter 14. The return of winter arrived with force that year, earlier and more severe than the oldest could remember. By mid-November, a snowstorm covered the property with a white mantle that reached to the knees, transforming the familiar landscape into a new and silent territory. The paths disappeared, the stream froze, and the cabin was isolated from the town and neighboring properties. For Clara, Elias, and little Jonas, now almost 3 months old, began the time of gathering that winter imposed in those lands. Tasks were reduced to the essential: keeping the fire lit, caring for the animals in the stable, preserving the provisions they had stored during autumn, ensuring that accumulated snow did not damage the roof. In the intimacy forced by the weather, the family's rhythms became slower, more centered on the interior of the cabin. Jonas grew with the veracity of healthy babies, each day more aware of the world around him. His first smiles, reflexes at first, then increasingly intentional, illuminated the cabin more than the fire in the chimney. Clara discovered new dimensions in her relationship with Elias. Without the constant pressure of outdoor tasks, they found time for longer conversations, to share memories they had not yet revealed, to imagine together the future they wished to build. On a particularly cold night, with the wind howling around the cabin like a hungry animal, Clara observed Elias as he read aloud by the fire. Jonas slept peacefully in his cradle, wrapped in blankets she herself had woven. The scene, the trembling light of the lamps, the warmth of the hearth, the beloved voices, created a feeling of refuge that contrasted with the exterior storm. "Sometimes I think about how different everything would have been if you hadn't appeared that day," said Clara, interrupting the reading. "If you had continued on your way the next morning." Elias closed the book, marking the page with a piece of string. "I think about that too," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the fire. "For years, I never stayed more than a few months in the same place. I always felt I should keep moving, as if what I was looking for was in the next town, in the next territory." "And what changed?" asked Clara, although she believed she knew the answer. Elias raised his gaze to her, with that quiet intensity that was so characteristic of him. "I understood that sometimes what we seek is not a place but a way of being in the world," he replied, choosing his words carefully. With you both, I found that. A purpose, a sense of belonging that has nothing to do with the land but with the people." Clara nodded, understanding perfectly. She, who had been anchored to that piece of land by the promise made to her father, had discovered that the true home was not in the walls of the cabin, nor in the boundaries of the property, but in the bonds they had created. "When my father died," she said, sharing thoughts that had been slowly forming for months, "I stayed because I felt that was what I owed him, that abandoning this place would be like abandoning him. But now I understand that what he really wanted was not for me to stay here forever, but to find my own path, my own way of being in the world." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable but reflective, full of mutual understanding. The wind continued to beat against the windows, but inside the cabin there was a calm that went beyond the absence of noise, the serenity of those who have found an anchor amid the storm. "If spring brings good harvests," Elias finally said, "we could build a mill by the stream. The town is growing, and the nearest mill is a 2-day journey. It would be a good business and would allow us to expand the property." Clara smiled, recognizing in his words not just a practical plan, but a declaration of intentions, a vision of the future that included roots and growth. "My father always said this land had potential," she replied, rising to stoke the fire, "that it just needed the right hands to work it." Elias joined her by the chimney, surrounding her with his arms as they both watched. "The flames dance, and a heart willing to see beyond the evident," he added, gently kissing her temple. That night, as the storm continued its assault against the outside world, Clara understood that what had once seemed an obligation, to remain on that land, to keep her father's memory alive, had transformed into a conscious choice, an act of will and love. She was not tied to the past, but connected to it in a way that allowed her to move toward the future, with freedom and purpose. Winter would continue for months, physically isolating them from the rest of the world. But in that isolation, in that time suspended between seasons, the small family found not limitations but possibilities, not confinement but expansion, not solitude but an intimacy that strengthened the bonds that united them. Chapter 3. Revealed. Spring-winter retreated, slowly, like a guest reluctant to leave. First was the constant dripping of icicles hanging from the roof, then the patches of dark earth appearing between the snow. Finally, the return of birds announcing with their songs the renewal of the cycle. The spring of 1884 arrived with the promise of a new beginning. Jonas, now almost 8 months old, crawled with determination across the cabin floor, exploring every corner with the insatiable curiosity proper to his age. His first teeth had appeared during the winter, and with them his first attempts at words, sounds that only Clara and Elias could interpret, but that for them were as eloquent as any conversation. With the thaw, the family's routine expanded again toward the exterior. Elias began preparations for the mill by the stream, gathering materials, designing the structure, calculating the force of the water. Clara sowed the expanded garden, incorporating new varieties of seeds they had acquired through the traveling salesman. Tomatoes, peppers, medicinal herbs that didn't grow naturally in the region. One morning in early May, while Clara was collecting eggs from the henhouse with Jonas in tow in his leather baby carrier, a movement on the path caught her attention. A rider slowly approached, following the path still muddy from the thaw. For an instant, she felt an echo of that day almost 2 years earlier, when Elias had appeared in the same way. But this rider was different, younger, with an air of urgency in his posture that contrasted with Elias's cautious approach that first time. Clara left the eggs and headed toward the house, instinctively protective. The young man stopped his horse at a respectful distance and dismounted with agile movements. He wore the dusty but recognizable uniform of the Postal Service and held an envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Boone?" he asked, advancing a few steps. Clara stopped, surprised both by the question and by the fact that someone was specifically looking for her. It had been years since she had received correspondence. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she corrected, although she felt a strange warmth at hearing Elias's surname associated with her. The young man nodded, as if the correction confirmed something he already knew. "I have a letter for you, ma'am," he said, extending the envelope. "It comes from Pennsylvania. I've been trying to deliver it for weeks, but winter blocked the roads until recently." Clara took the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The paper was of good quality, and the address was written in an elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. There was no return address, only a Philadelphia stamp in the upper corner. She thanked the young man, who politely refused her invitation, to rest and have something, claiming he had more deliveries pending. She watched him move away along the same path by which he had come, and only then examined the letter more closely. Jonas, intrigued by the new object, tried to reach it with his small hands. Clara adjusted him in the baby carrier and headed toward the stream, where Elias was working on the foundations of the mill. She found him standing in the water up to his knees, placing stones to create a solid base. Upon seeing her approach with the envelope in her hand, his expression changed as if he perceived the importance of the moment without needing words. "A letter has arrived," said Clara when he came out of the water to meet her. "From Pennsylvania." Elias dried his hands on his pants and took the envelope she offered him, examining it with the same mixture of curiosity and caution. "Have you opened it?" he asked, returning the letter to her. Clara shook her head. "I wanted you to be here," Seated on the bank of the stream, with Jonas now playing on a blanket spread beside them, Clara carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several pages of fine paper, covered by the same elegant handwriting as the address. "My dear Clara," the letter began. As she read, her expression went from surprise to astonishment. The letter was signed by Elizabeth Darrow, an old friend of her mother's whom Clara barely remembered. The woman explained that she had been looking for her for years, since she learned of Samuel Whitmore's death. As executor of the will of Clara's aunt, Margaret Whitmore, she had tried to locate her to inform her of an inheritance, a considerable sum of money and properties in Philadelphia that the aunt, who had never married or had children, had left to her only niece. "I never knew my aunt had money," murmured Clara, turning the pages with trembling fingers. "My father broke relations with his family when he decided to come west. He never spoke of them." Elias listened in silence, his face reflecting the understanding of what that news meant. Options, possibilities, decisions to make. "This changes things," he finally said, his voice cautious but firm. Clara looked up from the letter, finding Elias's eyes, which observed her with a mixture of love and concern. "Does it?" she asked, genuinely unsure. Elias took her hand, a gesture that had become their way of communicating the most important things. "It means you have options," he replied. "You could return to Pennsylvania, give Jonas a different life, with more comforts, more opportunities." Clara looked at her son, who had managed to sit up and was now hitting the ground with a small branch, fascinated by the sound it produced. Then she observed the stream, the foundations of the mill, the cabin visible in the distance, the newly sown garden. Finally, she looked again at Elias, the man who had arrived following the smoke from her chimney and had become the center of her new world. "My home is here," she said, with a certainty that surprised even herself. "Our home. This is the place where I want Jonas to grow up, where I want him to learn the value of work, of the land, of things built with one's own hands." Her slow smile appeared on Elias's face, like the sun emerging from behind clouds. "Are you sure?" he asked, although his eyes already reflected that he knew the answer. Clara nodded, carefully folding the letter and putting it in the pocket of her dress. "The money will allow us to finish the mill more quickly," she said, her practical mind already calculating possibilities. "Perhaps hire help for the next harvest, expand the property. But this is our place. What we've built here couldn't be recreated anywhere else." Elias drew her to him, embracing her with an intensity that communicated all that words could not express: gratitude, relief, love, shared certainty. Jonas, as if perceiving the importance of the moment, crawled toward them and clung to his father's legs, babbling sounds that vaguely resembled "Papa." Elias lifted him with one arm, incorporating him into the family embrace. There, by the stream that would soon move the wheels of the mill, under the open sky of Montana, Clara understood that the true inheritance was not in the money or properties mentioned in the letter, but in the ability to consciously choose one's own path, to build a life based not on obligations of the past or others' expectations, but on present love and shared hopes for the future. Chapter 14. The Light Between. The pine's autumn again tinted the woods with gold and scarlet. 6 months had passed since the arrival of the letter, and the property reflected the changes that this unexpected turn of destiny had made possible. The mill by the stream was completed, its large wooden wheels moving with the current in a constant and powerful rhythm. It had already begun to attract farmers from nearby properties who brought their grain to grind, turning the once solitary path to the cabin into an increasingly traveled route. The property had expanded, incorporating adjacent lands that Clara had bought with part of her inheritance: new corrals, a larger stable, a barn that could store harvest sufficient to survive even the harshest winters. They had hired help for the harvest, 2 young brothers from town who now worked permanently on the Daherty, living in a small cabin that Elias had built for them. But the most significant changes were not the visible ones. They were those that had occurred within Clara, in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The letter had acted as a catalyst, forcing her to consciously consider what had before been a passive acceptance of the path life had assigned her. By choosing to stay, by rejecting the possibility of an easier life in Philadelphia, Clara had made completely her own the decision that had initially been her father's. The property was no longer an inherited responsibility, but a chosen project, an expression of her vision and her values. One afternoon in late October, Clara decided to visit the plum grove. Jonas, now over a year old, was taking his first uncertain steps, clinging to her fingers with a determination that recalled Elias's. She mounted him on the horse with her, securing him against her chest as she rode slowly along the familiar path. The forest had changed with the season. The trees that in spring were covered with white flowers now displayed golden leaves that fell in lazy spirals with each breeze. The ground was covered by a crunching carpet of dry leaves that fascinated Jonas, who tried to catch them as they slid through the air. Clara dismounted and sat with her son under one of the largest trees, the same one where she and Elias had shared confidences that first spring. Jonas crawled around her, enthusiastically exploring this new territory, occasionally returning to her to show her some discovered treasure, a particularly large leaf, a shiny stone, an insect that quickly moved away from his curious hands. "Your father will come soon," Clara told him, though she knew the child didn't yet fully understand her words. "He's finishing loading the flour for town." As if she had conjured his presence with the words, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Shortly after, Elias appeared among the trees, mounted on his black horse. Seeing them, he dismounted with that fluid grace she had always admired and approached with a smile that illuminated his eyes. Jonas, recognizing his father, tried to stand up and take a few wobbling steps toward him, falling on the leaves with a laugh that bubbled like spring water. Elias lifted him and tossed him in the air, catching him safely amid shared laughter. "I've brought something," he said, sitting next to Clara and placing Jonas in his lap. From his saddlebag, he took a small book bound in leather. Clara took it with curiosity, running her fingers over the simple but elegant cover. "I bought it from the traveling bookseller who passed by the mill yesterday," Elias explained. "It's a collection of poems. I thought we could read them together during the winter, and someday teach Jonas to love words as much as trees and the land." Clara opened the book, leafing through the pages with reverent care. She had grown up with few books, and each one was a treasure. This one, chosen especially for her, for them, had a value that went beyond its material content. "Read me something, now," she asked, leaning against the trunk of the tree while Jonas, exhausted by excitement and exploration, began to doze in his father's arms. Elias leafed through the book until he found a poem he had marked. With a soft but clear voice, he began to read verses that spoke of trees, of roots, of the wisdom that is only achieved by growing slowly, anchored to the earth but aspiring to the sky. The words floated in the forest air, mixing with the whisper of the leaves and the increasingly deep breathing of Jonas asleep. Clara closed her eyes, letting Elias's voice envelop her like a blanket woven with familiar and beloved sounds. In that moment, she felt a clarity that was like light filtering between the trees. The understanding that the life they had built together, imperfect, demanding, sometimes difficult, but deeply theirs, was exactly the one they would have chosen if they could have seen the future that first day, when their paths crossed. As the sun began its descent, tinting the forest with a golden and oblique light that filtered between the pine trunks like luminous threads, Clara, Elias, and little sleeping Jonas formed a picture that contained all the essence of their story, an encounter that seemed casual but had turned out to be as inevitable as the seasons, a love built slowly with the patience of those who know that the most valuable things require time, a family forged not only by blood but by daily decisions, by shared moments, by silences as eloquent as words. The path back to the cabin, now larger, more solid, but still recognizable as the refuge it had been from the beginning, was illuminated by the last rays of the sun, creating a golden path between the trees. Clara rode with Jonas asleep against her chest, while Elias advanced by her side, so close that occasionally their knees touched. They didn't need to speak to know they shared the same thought, that the true home was not a place, but a way of being. In the world together, creating each day with patient hands and determined hearts the life they had chosen. And so, between the light that filtered through the pines, the Whitmore Boone family returned home, carrying with them the quiet certainty of those who have found in an ever-changing world an anchor and a horizon, deep roots and wings to fly.